Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar, Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence, Virtual Training, Part 3 of 3. My name is Nancy Creel with AdvaMed, and I will be today's webinar facilitator, along with my colleagues Erin Leahy and Laura Weslowski. Before we get started, I'd like to announce some housekeeping items. Each participant is in listen-only mode, meaning that your line is muted. There will be a Q&A session at the end of each presentation. Please type your questions in the questions chat function within your GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Please also note that this presentation is being recorded. Many webinar platforms have experienced an influx of use in recent months. So should you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, first attempt to exit the broadcast and rejoin. There's a link for general troubleshooting guide in the chat box as well. If any of the panelists experience audio or technical difficulties, please let us know using the chat function. Today's webinar recording and the presenter's slides will be available to attendees within 24 hours of the conclusion of the broadcast at www.interamericancoalition-medtech.org. This concludes the housekeeping portion of our webinar. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Sandra Gonzalez to get us started. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you, Nancy. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the third training session organized by the Coalition for Regulatory Convergence in the Medical Technology Sector on GRPs and TBTs, which will complete a review on these topics and that will help us during our fourth and last session to better understand the rationale behind and the way US FDA has developed and implemented some of their current policies. We're very pleased to have Renata Amaral joining us again today, Jessica Rupp, Joe Lulling, and Stephen Bipes, who will walk us through the World Trade Organization and TBT Agreement as GRP, International Standards and Conformity Assessment as GRP, International Standards and Standard Development Organizations for Medical Technology, closing with an overview of the national standards bodies. Let's get started with Renata, whose background and experience I shared in our previous session. So Renata, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra, and good morning, everyone. So today we are going to kind of go deeper into the trade aspects of good regulatory practices and technical barriers to trade. The outline of this presentation is presented to you right now. So we are going to go through WTO general rules, non-tariff barriers to trade, coverage of the TBT agreement, main principles of the agreement, relevant provisions, and the e-ping system that I would like to introduce to you for those who doesn't know it yet. So the WTO agreement on technical barriers to trade, before we start, entered into force in 1995 together with the launch of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and is the multilateral successor of the Standards Code, signed by 32 countries in 1979 during the Tokyo round of the GATT negotiations. The GATT is the agreement, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that preceded the WTO and that was signed by contracting parties just after the Second World War, also when the World Bank and the IMF were created. So just a little historical background. The purpose of the TBT agreement can be broadly described as 1. Assuring that technical regulations, standards, and conformity assessment procedures do not create unnecessary obstacles to international trade, while 2. Leaving members adequate regulatory discretion to protect human, animal, and plant life and health, national security, and the environment, consumers, and other policy interests. I think you Nancy, please, can you go back one slide? Now I'm going to the second slide. Thank you. So the WTO general rules, what does it mean? The WTO is the only international body dealing with the rules of trade between, today, 164 nations. The WTO agreements provide the legal ground rules for international commerce and international trade. They bind governments to keep their trade policies within agreed limits. They help trade flow as freely as possible, for example, by removing obstacles, providing confidence, transparency, and predictability. Now we can go to the next slide, please. So what are non-tariff barriers to trade? It's very easy for us to identify tariff barriers, right? It's very transparent. When a country changes an import tariff for a product, we all can see that very clearly. That's not the same for non-tariff barriers to trade, which can take the form of technical measures, standards, of international taxes or charges, of customs, rules, and procedures, quantitative import restriction, public procurement practices, subsidies and related government supports, investment restrictions or requirements, transport regulations or costs. So basically, the TBT agreement will cover all these kinds of non-tariff barriers to trade, and seeking always to balance two competing policy objectives of the countries. One, the prevention of protectionism, with the right of a member to enact product regulations for approved public policy purposes. For example, allowing members, that means allowing members sufficient regulatory autonomy to pursue necessary domestic policy objectives. We can go to the next slide. So over the years, since 1947, and as you can see in this graphic, 1947 was when members signed, the contracting parties signed the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that preceded the WTO. In the past, we had much more tariffs, restrictions, tariffs, barriers than no-tariff barriers. Over the years, this changed. So we have less and less tariff barriers to trade and growing, really impressive number of non-tariff barriers to trade. So the progressive tariff reductions that have taken place in the GATT-WTO framework have left certain industrial and political leaders looking for other means of protecting their industries. So this means of protection frequently take the form of non-tariff barriers. That is, means other than tariffs for protecting business sectors. Technical regulations, standards, and conformity assessment procedures are all potential non-tariff measures that are sometimes used for protectionist purposes. As such, they can be potential non-tariff barriers to international trade. We can go to the next slide, please. So the coverage of the TBT agreement is exactly what I mentioned before, 2 slides before. All these types of measures that are non-tariff can take the form of barriers to trade, and they are covered by the TBT agreement that we are discussing today. So the TBT agreement establishes rules and disciplines designed to prevent mandatory technical regulations, voluntary standards, and conformity assessment procedures from becoming unnecessary barriers to trade. However, the TBT agreement seeks to leave members with sufficient domestic policy autonomy to pursue legitimate regulatory objectives. We can go to the next slide, please. So basically what I'm saying is that the TBT agreement acts as an instrument to encourage members to use less trade restrictive approaches to meet regulatory objectives, harmonize through the use of relevant international standards, provide transparency, and avoid and resolve trade disputes related to standards matters. We can move to the next slide. The agreement also safeguards against the use of technical requirements as disguised restrictions on trade and the development of inefficient technical requirements and procedures. We can go to the next slide, Nancy. So what's the relevance of the WTO for good regulatory practice here in the context of the TBT agreement? Unnecessary regulatory differences can impose costs that prevent business from engaging in trade. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, plays an important role in supporting efforts to facilitate trade through regulatory cooperation among its 164 members today, offering a multilateral platform for dialogue among governments on trade rules and throughout the full rule-making cycle. The disciplines of the TBT agreement can help contribute with effectiveness and efficiency of regulations through good regulatory practices. It lays down specific legal disciplines which directly address the preparation, adoption, and application of domestic regulations on goods. The TBT agreement provides a unique multilateral transparency framework for regulations affecting the trade in goods. We can move to the next slide. So what are the main principles of the TBT agreement? I'll just wait for the next slide so you can follow me. Yeah, thank you. So the main principles are non-discrimination among governments and countries, avoidance of unnecessary barriers to trade, harmonization through the use of international standards, guides, and recommendations, transparency, notification, and country inquiry points, concepts of equivalence of technical regulations and mutual recognition of results of conformity assessment procedures. Those are the main principles that guide all the rules established by the TBT agreement. We can move to the next slide. So here I bring the three main provisions that I would like you to keep in mind from this presentation. Article 2.2 of the TBT agreement establishes that members shall ensure that technical regulations are not prepared, adopted, or applied with a view to or with the effect of creating unnecessary obstacles to international trade. Article 2.3, technical regulations shall not be maintained if the circumstances or objectives giving rise to their adoption no longer exist, or if the changed circumstances or objectives can be addressed in a less trade restrictive manner. Article 2.4, where technical regulations are required and relevant international standards exist, or their completion is imminent, members shall use them or the relevant parts of them as a basis for their technical regulations. So here we are, the TBT agreement gives a strong emphasis to international standards where they exist and it indicates that countries should use international standards when they exist for specific products or sectors. Still in this slide, it's important to remember that both the preamble of the TBT, we can keep in the same slide. Thank you. Both the preamble of the TBT agreement and Article 2.2 of the TBT agreement identify certain regulatory goals that are deemed legitimate for regulatory purposes. Article 2.2 sets forth a list of legitimate TBT objectives, which includes protection of life, health, human, animal, and plant life, safety, human safety, protection of national security, protection of the environment, and prevention of deceptive marketing practices. The list of legitimate objectives in Article 2.2 is not exclusive. While not specified, it is widely agreed that technical harmonization, for example, regulations that standardize electrical products, computer communication equipment, etc., and quality standards, for example, grading requirements for procedure and commodities, are legitimate. Both technical harmonization and quality standards are already widely utilized, particularly by developed country members. So, principles to develop international standards. The WTO Committee on Technical Barriers to Trade adopted, it's the previous slide, yeah, thank you. The WTO Committee on Technical Regulations to Trade adopted a set of principles to which an organization engaged in the development of international standards must comply. This document is available online at the WTO website and is entitled Decision of the Committee on Principles for the Development of International Standards, Guides, and Recommendations with relation to Articles 2, 5, and Annex 3 of the agreement. As this presentation is going to be available for you after the presentations, you can also click in the hyperlink and the document is available there. We can move to the next slide. So Annex 1 of the TBT agreement brings some important definitions for us. What are technical regulations according to the TBT agreement? It's a document that lays down product characteristics or their related processes and production methods, including the applicable administrative provisions with which compliance is mandatory. Standard, a document approved by a recognized body that provides for common and repeated use, rules, guidelines, or characteristics for products or related processes and production methods with which compliance is not mandatory. Conformity assessment, any procedure used directly or indirectly to determine the relevant requirements in technical regulations or standards are fulfilled. Includes, inter alia, procedures for sampling, testing, and inspection, evaluation, verification, and assurance of conformity, registration, accreditation, and approval. We can move to the next slide, please. Major medical technology regulatory or trade challenges for our sector. The TBT agreement not implemented with most, it's not implemented with most medical device regulators. And this is true for most of the countries and organizations here attending to this meeting. Most medical device regulators, staff drafting regulators, are either not aware of the TBT agreement or not required to implement it by trade ministries. Most medical device regulators are not aware of the IMDRF guidance documents and the hundreds of relevant medical device standards upon which they should be basing their regulation. Most medical device regulators still opting to dedicate their limited public health resources towards developing their own country agency unique requirements. If there is awareness of the TBT agreement, implementation is ex post and not ex ante. Medical devices, as you all might know, are largely improperly regulated as drugs, which is a big mistake. So we can go to the next slide, and here I bring just 3 slides to present to you the EPING system from the WTO, because most of people don't use this system that is for free, and I think it's very useful for our sector included. So the EPING system is the result of 3 international organizations: the United Nations Department for Economic and Social Affairs, the WTO, and the International Trade Center, combining their expertise and experience to facilitate easy access to pertinent trade information, product requirements in foreign markets. So the UN built the pilot version of EPING as part of a trade capacity building project for least developed countries, and the WTO manages the depository of SPS, so sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and TBT notifications, and works together with SPS and TBT country inquiry points. On the EPING website, you can subscribe to receive email alerts on planned regulatory revisions covering products and our markets of interest to you. EPING also includes a communication platform where you can discuss these upcoming changes with fellow stakeholders and government officials, such as SPS TBT inquiry points. TBT anchoring points often serve as a liaison between national stakeholders and other WTO members, and can help tracking and addressing issues related to upcoming regulations. We can see in this slide you are at right now. So the system, here's just a picture of the system when you enter the WTO website. And the system is basically expected to help public and private stakeholders to track, consult, and comment on measures that are being developed and are adapt as necessary to changing regulatory conditions. So the system shares information on product requirements using data compiled by the WTO. And the WTO members are normally required to inform each other when planning to change product requirements and provide opportunity for other members to comment on these requirements. So they do, how do they do that? They do so by submitting a 2-page info sheet on the regulation with information on products covered, a brief summary of the regulation, and the deadline for providing comments. We can move to the final slide. And this is just another picture of the system. When you enter the system, you have all the 164 WTO members listed there. The address of their anchoring points, their contact, so you can get in touch to the anchoring points of any country, and comment or bring your doubts in relation to a specific regulation that was reported by the EPING system. So with this, I conclude my presentation today, and I'm open to questions if we have any.
Renata, thank you very much for this very comprehensive presentation. I think for a lot of us, these are still subjects that are kind of like new. So I myself is very appreciative for you translating all these complex items into a very understandable basic format. So really, thank you very much for doing this. We have not received any question from the audience yet. However, I always take advantage of having my microphone open to start asking a question. And in this case is, how does the TBT committee encourages the governments or even enforces the governments to comply in full to what they have committed by becoming a member of the committee?
Let me just ask you, can you just repeat the beginning of the question, Sandra, please? Because I think it was cut it for me a little bit in the beginning.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So the question is, how does the TBT committee encourages the governments to comply with the commitments they acquire while becoming a member of the committee, or even further, how does the committee enforces those commitments to be implemented or to be fulfilled?
So the committee, it doesn't enforce necessarily, but the WTO is, I always like to reinforce that the WTO is a member-driven organization. So everything that comes out from the WTO is on the interest of the members. The Secretariat has a very a specific role of keeping the ball rolling, but it doesn't enforce necessarily anything in the committees. Of course, we have the dispute settlement arm of the WTO, which is another conversation. But the committee, it's interesting because I was just reading something from the WTO website today, and it reports that we have a record number of concerns about technical barriers to trade raised via the online platform this month. So the way the committee works, and I think it's important for everybody to understand that the committee is open for every WTO member. So any country or any private stakeholder like us here can ask to its government to present a specific trade concern when there is a specific concern on the measures applied by another WTO member. You can also raise questions just to clarify what's the scope of a specific measure a member is applying. So the committee is an open space for everybody to use. And I think this is important because not many countries use the committee, the TBT committee, as they should. It's an open platform. We did a presentation back in February on behalf of the coalition, and I think it was a very good moment to explain our concerns with regard to good regulatory practices and the impact on trade. So the TBT committee is the perfect place actually, so we can connect these concerns with good regulatory practice from our governments, public policies, with the trade concerns, with the impact on trade they might have, because they might be more restrictive than necessary. They can be taking the format of a disguised restriction on trade, and we cannot see that so clearly. So the TBT committee is an open place to discuss measures, to clarify objectives of measures, and it's open to every WTO member and to private stakeholders as well.
Thank you very much, Renata. We got a comment from Sergio Madeira in regards of the acronyms that we are including in the presentation. So I'm offering that we may include a glossary before we post it into our website, so we can make sure that everybody is clearly understanding what we are referring to. So thank you very much for the comment, Sergio. Thank you, Renata, for your presentation. We have run out of time for this section, so if it is okay, we will then move to the next section in our agenda today. So I'll be transferring to Jessica Roop. She is the Senior Manager, International Policy for the American National Standards Institute, ANSI. Her primary regions of focus include the Americas, India, and Europe, having frequently represented the United States in bilateral and multilateral engagements, including through cooperative initiatives, technical exchanges, and capacity building programs with developing countries. Jessica manages all aspects of technical assistance funded grants by the U.S. government, specifically as it relates to India, working with the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, USTDA, and the Western Hemisphere, working with U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. Prior to her position at ANSI, Jessica worked for ASTM International in the Global Cooperation Division. Jessica received a Bachelor in English and Spanish for Arsinus College and a Master of Bilingual and Bicultural Studies from La Salle University. Jessica, please go ahead with your presentation, and thank you very much for joining us today.
And thank you, Sandra. This is Jessica Group, and I just wanted to welcome all of our participants on the presentation today, and to thank the Coalition for the opportunity to provide the presentation. I really want to note that Renata did an excellent job in providing you with a really sound basis of these key terms. The two things I just want to call to your attention specifically when we're talking about standards, we're talking about market-driven products, and they're really established by consensus. And when we talk about consensus, we're talking about substantial agreement that really has been reached directly and by materially affected interests and categories. And when we're talking about the difference between standards and a tech regulation, really the difference between the two relies in the compliance. While conformity with standards is voluntary, technical regulations by nature are mandatory, and they have different implications for international trade. And Renata again provided these definitions, so I'm not going to belabor them. I'm going to continue through the presentation. So if we can advance not only just to the second, we can go through the third slide, because we've already covered consensus, and here we go on international obligations of the WTO agreement. And again, when we talk about WTO, we're referring to the World Trade Organization's technical barriers to trade. From the future reference, I'm just going to call it the WTO TBT. It really ensures that regulations and standards and certification and testing procedures do not create unnecessary barriers to trade. You've heard Renata say that a couple of times. And really, what does that mean? We want to ensure that other economies and organizations are aware of a new or an updated standard or regulation. We want to ensure that there is recognition of international standards and their use. We want to ensure that there's non-discrimination against a particular standard being used in a particular country or region. And we want to ensure that there's a reasonable time to implement a change of the standard. Typically, it's a 60-day period. And when we talk about trying not to create unnecessary obstacles to trade, what does that mean? And really, a good example is for when we're talking about the government and when we prepare technical regulations to really achieve a certain policy objective, whether it be for human health, or safety, or the environment. The negotiation should not be more trade restrictive than necessary to fulfill that legitimate objective. And according to the TBT agreement, we're talking about product regulations in terms of performance rather than design or descriptive characteristics. That will also help in avoiding these unnecessary obstacles to international trade. If we could advance to the next slide. So here you'll see these guiding principles of the WTO TBT agreement. Renata again had noted these and where they are included in the specific areas within the WTO agreement. So it's that TBT section 8, revision 8, section 9. And we're talking about the use of international standards. And these are globally accepted standardization principles. And they should not, and it should be noted that regardless of where the standards developer is domiciled, as long as it adheres and complies to these specific principles that you see in front of you, they in turn can be deemed as an international standards developer. So when we're talking about transparency, we're talking about standards that are open and predictable. When we speak about openness, we're talking about membership and participation are open to the people and organizations around the world, not just to one country or one organization. Effective and relevance, we want to keep standards at pace of innovation and industry and technology. And the international standards need to be relevant to effectively respond to the regulatory and market needs, as well as scientific and technological advances. In coherence, we want to avoid duplication, and we want to make sure that we collaborate. In development dimension, we want to be cognizant of other developing countries and to support some of the work that might be needed there. In impartiality and consensus, there's that word consensus again, that balance of interests. And we want to make sure that we're not giving privilege or favor to one of the interests of a particular supplier, of a particular country, or a particular region. We can advance to the next slide. So when we're speaking about international standards, again, standards really are the process of that is really to meet the societal needs. And as Renata again, and I'm going to continue to say this, they should not act as barriers to trade. The standards need to meet these WTO principles that we just spoke about, that are international standards, those guiding principles, regardless of the organization that developed them or the location where they were developed. And when we talk about the code of good practice for the preparation, adoption, and application of standards, we call this the code, is really open for acceptance to any standardizing bodies, whether it be central government, local government, or non-governmental and regional standards bodies. And this code of good practice is contained in the Annex 3 of the WTO Principles Agreement. And really what it does is it seeks to bring all standards within the purview and provides and gives transparency in the preparation, adoption, and application of standards. We can move to the next slide. So when looking at compliance in the US, I just wanted to bring a specific example to mind here. And as you know, I work for the American National Standards Institute, and in the US, the way we comply in this process of showing our process and complying with the use and example of the principles, we have the essential requirements when we're dealing with accreditation. And in the US, accreditation of standards developing organizations is really in verifying the process in which standards are developed, and not the technical validity of the standard. And the process is based on the principles that are very similar. These main principles in the WTO agreement are the same principles that are used in the ANSI essential requirements to ensure that they follow the voluntary process in the US of open, transparency, due process, and consensus. And this is just one example of how different regions and countries can exemplify the use of these specific principles. We can move to the next slide. So some of you may already be aware of what ISO is, but it might be helpful as just a sound basis of what the organization is and where it all began. And ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, is a non-government organization, and its story really began back in 1946, really in the aftermath of the Second World War, where countries came together to create a new organization and to really promote the use of industrial standards around the globe. And in 1947, the new International Organization for Standardization was officially born. And beginning its operations, ISO has published over 19,000 international standards. It's based in Geneva, Switzerland, and it has over 160, specifically 164 member countries that participate in its organization. And it's a one body representing each country. And as you can see there, the mission is to promote the development of standardization and activities in the world, and to facilitate that international exchange of services and goods, and to develop cooperation on scientific and technological and economic activities. If we can move to the next slide, we'll focus a little bit as well on IEC. and that is the International Electrotechnical Commission. This really addresses, the specific organization addresses magnetics and electromagnetics, multimedia, telecommunications, energy production, as specifically in terminology and development and safety for the environment. It has full members of 62 full members and associate members of 26, with a total of 88 total members. And it has over 209 technical committees and subcommittees within its organization. It was founded in 1906, specializing again in that electrical and electronic products field. And it's a per country member structure where national committees appoint experts and delegates coming from industry and government bodies and associations and academia. So they are open to participation in the technical conformity assessment work in the work of IEC. If we can move to the next slide. So switching gears a little bit, we're talking about accreditation, and I've highlighted some of the very important aspects of what accreditation truly is. And when we look at this, it's really the conformity assessment is the independent evaluation of conformity assessment bodies. We call them CABs, against recognized standards to carry out specific activities to ensure their impartiality and competence. Accreditation bodies are established in many economies with the primary purpose to ensure that conformity assessment bodies are essentially subject to oversight by an authoritative body. And accreditation bodies have been peer evaluated as competent. They sign regional and international arrangements to demonstrate this competence and this compliance. And then these accreditation bodies then assess the conformity assessment bodies in adherence to specific relevant standards. Let me move to the next slide, please. This graph really provides a really helpful example of conformity assessment in the evaluation against standards to carry out specific activities operating in accordance with, you can see at the top of that graph, the International Organization for Standardization and the International Electrotechnical Commission specific standard 17011, and that is really involved with the accreditation of conformity assessment bodies. And as you see below, for each evaluation, there is a specific standard that has to be adhered to. So, for example, to be accredited in the laboratory sector, you have to adhere to the ISO IEC standard 17025 as an example. Why don't we move to the next slide? Thank you. So the IAF, the International Accreditation Forum, is a world association of conformity assessment bodies in the fields of specifically management systems, products, services, and personnel, and other similar forms or programs of conformity assessment. And essentially its function is to develop a single worldwide program of conformity assessment to reduce that risk and to ensure that the accredited certificates are reliable. The overall objective, if you can learn anything specifically about this organization, is certified once, accepted everywhere. And the accreditation body membership of IAF is really open to bodies conducting and administering programs which accredit bodies for, again, that certification and registration of quality systems, products, personnel, and of similar programs in conformity assessment, which talk about common intention to join this IAF multilateral recognition agreement when we talk about the MLA program. And that talks about the recognizing of equivalence of each other's accreditation to their own. Thank you for advancing this slide. We can go to the next because we're going to talk a little bit about, oh, go back one for me, please. I think maybe I had missed one. There we go. And we're talking about the accreditation bodies around the world. We talk about the IAF. It's talking about the evaluation of peers as being competent. And under this IAF agreement and this forum, we're talking about the agreements and acceptance of accredited certification for the organization. I think what's happening here is there is a new slide in between ILAC. If you go to the next, one more, There we go. We're talking about the IAF MLA Mark. And again, that's that multilateral recognition agreement where you are evaluated by peers as being competent. So it's that peer assessment based on, again, that ISO IEC 17011. And we're talking about the purpose of that agreement is really to ensure that the mutual recognition of accredited certification between signatories to that MLA, that multilateral agreement, and the subsequent acceptance of accredited certification in many market-based as one accreditation. So for the government, the IAF MLA really provides a credible and robust framework on which to further develop and enhance the government-to-government bilateral and multilateral international trade agreements. It really talks about the free trade goal of certified once and accepted everywhere is realized. For the public sector, this talks about, there's a joint website that has been developed in the IAF, the ILAC space, and for ISO, and it showcases and benefits the accrediting testing and inspection to meet policy objectives. And the accreditation in the IAF MLA helps regulators really to meet their legislated responsibilities by providing a globally recognized system to accept accredited certification. So if we go back one slide, I apologize, so these are a little bit out of order. There we go. The ILAC is the International Laboratory Accreditation Cooperation. So somewhat similar in idea, but it's dissimilar in the fact that it's about the inspection of accreditation bodies in the laboratory space. This operates in accordance again with the ISO's IEC 17011 and includes another list of additional standards, which were referred to in the previous slide with the graph, with all of those specific areas. If you're talking about testing laboratories, it has to adhere to a specific standard, which is noted here on the slide for you. So why don't we skip, not to the next, but the one after that. Perfect, thank you. So in conclusion, why are standards important? And really, why are we talking about them today? Standards are important because they help to reduce costs and minimize waste and limit errors and increase productivity. They help companies to access new markets and developing countries to facilitate that international trade. And they provide the ability to provide safety, protection for not only the environment, for you as people too, the consumer and the market, and to protect from the climatic and other adverse conditions. And standards really, in conclusion, provide that common language that keeps domestic and international trade flowing. And if we move to the next slide, we'll talk about, so why is conformity assessment important? And it talks about the non-acceptance of test reports and certificates that can then cause non-tariff obstacles to trade. And we look at conformity assessment, we want to find a harmonized approach to conformity assessment standards to facilitate that trade. So we want to avoid duplication in the conformity assessment space. We want to eliminate costs and provide access to each other's markets. And the aspects of conformity assessment and standards are extremely important and is one of the reasons that we're focusing it on today. Why don't we move to the next slide? This is just a compilation of some helpful resources for your future use. Obviously, we've said we would share this presentation so you can utilize the links at your leisure. And if we move to the final slide, not only would I be happy to answer any questions, but I've also been able to, I've included my contact information for future use by the organizations that are on the call today. And I just want to again thank everyone for the opportunity to speak, and it's really been a wonderful experience. So I'd be happy to take any questions, Sandra.
Jessica, thank you very much for your presentation. I think that it compiles, and we know that was a real challenge for you. It compiles a wealth of information in a very short period, and we thank you for providing also your contact information so the members of the coalition may reach out to you. So thank you very much. We received the question, and if you don't mind, I'd like to address that through Stephen, that it goes in regards of any example of change or improvement of regulation of a certain country due to the technical barriers to trade committee. So Stephen, if you can address that for us, and in the meantime, we are receiving also some other questions that we can address as soon as Stephen helps us with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. And I will give two examples, one from the medical device sector and one from out. From the medical device sector, and usually the way that the governments deal with the issues at the TBT committee is they have different levels of escalation. When a country, any country, whether that's Brazil or the US or Japan, if they identify what they believe is a technical barrier to trade, the government representatives to the TBT committee will have what's called a side discussion. They will enter into direct bilateral conversations with the other economy, the WTO member, to see if they, to raise the concern, the so-called specific trade concern, STC, one of the acronyms we'll add to the list. And they try hard to resolve the issue prior to it becoming a full-fledged TBT issue. If the two parties are not able to resolve the issue, they will then raise it as an issue on in the plenary of the TBT committee, which meets 3 times a year. And then if that resulting engagement does not result in a resolution, then it becomes a quote-unquote case, a full case of the TBT committee. And then all of the machinery and the mechanisms of the WTO can kick in. It'll go to arbitration, or it goes through the appeals board all the way up to the final level, and then the governance of the WTO can determine what the appropriate sanctions are. But if it's determined that indeed the measure was a technical barrier to trade, then the affected parties have the right to several different avenues of recourse. It can be retaliation, WTO sanctioned retaliation, etc. And I can let the others jump in. But usually, the objective, just like with any legislation, is to avoid the issue getting to that level. And I would say the majority of the specific trade concerns are resolved in bilateral discussions. There was the concern back with the prior to the MDSAP program. You had the issue of different governments, including Brazil, wishing to inspect the different facilities for good manufacturing practice inspection, albeit with insufficient number of inspectors. And at the time, this was one of the issues that was brought to the attention of the governments, in particular with the US and Brazil. It did not, and thankfully, through the cooperation between the Brazilian and US government, they agreed to resolve the matter. And I think that in part led to the development of the MDSAP program under the IMDRF. An example I'd give outside the medical technology sector was, I think Peru, one of the European countries had claimed that Peru was infringing on their area by calling the fish that they were fishing sardines, and the Europeans were saying they could only come from Sardinia. And Peru prevailed in that measure because it had been recognized that sardine was no longer something that was pertained only to Sardinia. There may be other examples that the other panelists can provide, but that was the quick answer to Carlos's question.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And we have a request from Sergio Madeira. His request is, could you please provide us with a diagram with all these organizations and its interrelations and subordinations? And I think in that sense, Steve, we can work on that and provide that to the whole audience, as it seems to be like very valuable to have like a quick diagram to help being more and more familiarized with all the interrelationships that exist, and moreover to be in a possibility to really take more and more advantage of understanding that, So we may find the opportunities to become an active part of those and getting the benefit towards reaching our vision. Is it okay, Stephen?
Yes, that'd be fine. We'll take that.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And we have no additional questions, Jessica, so thank you very much for your presentation. And of course, we welcome all the participants to forward any additional question that may arise after we are finishing with the session today. Please address that to the executive committee at the coalition, and we will be more than glad to forward those to the panelists joining us today. So without further say, then we will continue with the third part of our program today. I'm pleased to introduce Joe Luling. He's Vice President, Standards Development at the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, with responsibility over emerging technologies and health IT. Among other responsibilities, Joe established and manages the Health IT Standards Initiative and its corresponding international initiative to develop standards for health software, which by then was a new initiative at AAMI. He also led the efforts to develop guidance for quality systems for combination products, and he also initiated and shared initial joint AAMI-UAL effort to develop standards for medical device interoperability. Joe holds a Master in International Transaction by George Mason University and a Master of Arts in Physical Anthropology by the University of Tennessee. Joe, thank you for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I very much appreciate the invitation and opportunity to address the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence. I especially think it's an incredibly timely initiative, given what we have seen with the recent pandemic and the challenges in global supply lines, and I think that we will see an increasing trade between the North and the South hemispheres in the area of medical devices and healthcare products as a result of seeking more regional sources sometimes, so that we can avoid those shortages that we've seen in the last few months. And I think it's a very timely initiative, and I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of it. I'm going to start my presentation by reiterating the principles and purposes of medical standardization, which have been touched upon by the previous speakers already, of course, and are reiterated in the World Trade Organization's Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement. The first principle, of course, is that we only do standards where there is a need. As was pointed out, a regulation or a standard that is unnecessary very easily becomes a hindrance to trade. It adds cost to products, and it prevents the ability of people to access those products. Standardization also focuses on those principles of openness, transparency, and due process, which were previously discussed. I think it's very important to understand that standardization is not someone on high speaking down to the community, but it's a consensus process which requires the voices of the experts from around the world, but also the stakeholders, the people that will be affected by the standards. For medical devices, the focus is on safety, efficacy, and access. The attention, we want to write standards that tell tell manufacturers what their devices must do, how they must perform, how they must ensure safety, but not how they're designed. We want technology to change and advance, and so we avoid, whenever possible, design specifications that could freeze technology in place. The medical device industry also has a strong preference for one standard, global solutions. It's not always possible because there are national and regional conditions that require differences in standardization. But to the extent possible, it's preferable that the entire globe be following a single standard that sets requirements for safety and efficacy. Again, multiple standards means multiple compliances, and it can create barriers to trade. We also believe our standards should be aligned with technical regulations. Standards are voluntary, and they must support the requirements that are given in technical regulations. And the goal for our standardization projects is always better patient outcomes. The next slide, please. Again, I pointed out the 3 pillars of standardization: access, safety, and effectiveness. Security underlies those now, with cybersecurity being something that can affect any of these. The goal for a standard is to create better patient outcomes, and those 3 aspects, access, safety, and effectiveness, are the legs to the stool. If you can write a standard that creates fantastic safety, but if it doesn't also ensure that the device is effective, it's not going to do any good. Similarly, you could make something that was effective and not safe, and that is not going to lead to better patient outcomes. And finally, whatever requirements you require for safety and effectiveness must also be balanced with the need for people to actually access the equipment. A perfectly safe and effective device does nothing to help better patient outcomes if people don't have access to it. They can't afford it, or it's not available to them wherever they are. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about the traditional role of regulations, or the historic role of medical device regulations, and in making sure that devices are effective and safe before they come to market. And I realize a wall is a little bit of a controversial metaphor to use here, but in many ways, the existing regulations, the regulations that were developed back beginning in the 60s, really have basically formed as a wall. It was very important to ensure that a device was safe and effective before it entered the market. It's a comparatively simple regulatory approach compared to some of the ones we're moving to now. And it does work, but it has its drawbacks. It hinders access to new products because they take a longer time to get through that pre-market approval to make sure that they're okay. It does not ensure ongoing product quality. Ensuring that something is safe and effective when it enters the market does not necessarily ensure that it continues to be effective throughout its life cycle. It also does not ensure ongoing product improvement of quality over time. It does not promote innovation, and regulation should allow for quality improvement and promote innovation whenever possible. It does not ensure the detection of emergent defects. If we know something is safe and effective when it goes onto the market, that does not necessarily ensure that some fault that we were not aware of is detected and resolved moving forward. So next slide, please. This is a quick example of the gatekeeper pre-market approach, pre-market approval, making sure something is effective before it's sold. You have a device, in this case, a transducer. You have regulations, and I'm using the US regulations here, that specify requirements for that device. And then you have a standard, and I'm using the AMI standard on the sideline here, American National Standard for Blood Pressure Transducers, as an example of how the standards support the regulations, which have specific requirements for the device. It's a system that works very well and has worked well to help promote safe and effective medical devices. Next slide, please. I mentioned that the limitations of the gatekeeper pre-market approach. And for some time now, both regulations and standards have been evolving to a more nuanced systems approach to managing safety and effectiveness across the life cycle. In other words, they're not just looking at the quality of the product as it leaves the shipping dock, but they're looking at how it's used throughout its life cycle, and how that it interacts with the entire healthcare environment. Again, those all can affect safety, effectiveness, and access, so that's important. The life cycle approach, it does promote safety and effectiveness throughout the life cycle, facilitates the entry of new products, because if you know you have the ability to find defects in the use, then you can be a little bit more lax about accepting it into the market. The gatekeeper approach, the village wall. If you know you have the ability to ensure safety inside the village, you can be a little bit more open with the gateway into the village. It ensures ongoing quality and improvement of quality of products, and it ensures that those emergent hazards and defects that we only discover during the use of the device are identified and addressed. Next slide, please. When you think about a product and you try to understand what hurdles it must overcome before it reaches the market, this is a good example. You have on the left-hand side of the screen, you have the factory, the producers. And to get to the patients on the far right-hand side, you have to go through first the scientific and technical hurdles of creating the device, the clinical hurdles where you show that it's safe and effective, the regulatory hurdles where a regulator judges it safe and effective and allows it on the market, the post-market hurdles, the market hurdles where people accept a market, something is safe and effective. And just because you put it on the market does not necessarily mean that it's automatically accepted by the clinicians. And then the post-market safety and effective hurdles where you are addressing safety and technical issues that arise after it has been issued on the market. Below, you'll see a series of 3 horizontal boxes that talk about how we build the controls for medical devices in a systems lifecycle approach. At the very bottom, you have essential principles of safety and performance, the essential things that that a medical device or medical technology must do to be effective and be safe. The International Medical Devices Regulatory Forum, IMDRF, has published a list of essential principles in 2018, which is a very good and comprehensive list of the things that a medical device must do in order to be safe and effective. The EU has its own essential requirements in the medical device directives. The USA has this in its regulation, and particularly in the performance pathways that it is now doing. Australia and other countries have these. The IMDRF is a very good compilation of those and very useful, beginning to help regulators align their regulations around agreement about what it means for a device to be safe and effective. And that is the next line, the total product lifecycle regulation. Thank you. Where the regulators act to write regulations to support the essential principles. And the standards are on top of that. They should be developed to support both those regulations and the underlying essential principles. Next slide, please, now. So we've said that the regulations and standards are evolving from the gatekeeper pre-market approval approach to a more systematic life cycle approach. But there are a lot of things happening now that are challenges for both regulators and medical standards developers, as well as the manufacturers. We have technical convergences now happening. Medical devices used to be fairly simple. Even the early heart rate monitors and things like that were integrated circuitry or vacuum tube based. And now we see that those devices are becoming more complicated in terms of software, computational ability, but they're also becoming more complicated as they become combined with drugs and devices or biologics and tissues, combination products. Combination products in this case meaning both medical hardware, medical devices that are combined with drugs and biologics, and medical devices that are combined with IT. Next slide, please. The other thing that's happening are changes in manufacturing and information technology that are moving medical device producers from becoming product providers to becoming service providers of healthcare. Years ago, an implant company would sell an implant to a hospital, and the surgeon would go in and do the surgery on their own. Now it's very common, if not standard practice, for a representative of the manufacturer to be in the hospital assisting the surgeon to help them with the sizing, to help make sure that they're addressing any problems with the device that come across. And you see more and more of that. The future vision is that eventually these medical device companies will actually be providing services at the patient bedside as much as they are providing products. Next slide, please. So what this means for medical device standards developers is that we have a lot of different focuses that we're moving to now. Again, we're trying to make sure that our standards provide safety and effectiveness across the total product lifecycle, moving to a systems approach. We are writing standards to address those combination products that I mentioned, drug-device combinations, device-tissue combinations, and of course, devices that include software, artificial intelligence, or which are being connected into networks of many devices or general health networks. We're addressing emergent technologies. We are working at distributed remote healthcare systems to write standards that apply not just to the manufacturer, but to the use of that product across the healthcare provision. And more that includes outside of the hospital, mobile apps, remote telemedicine, and things like that. We're moving towards faster processes. The technology change for the past 50 years has been increasing at an exponential rate. And that's a challenge for standards because standards typically are based on experience. As the pace of technology change increases, we have less and less experience with the technology. So we're developing faster processes to evaluate medical devices, to gather information about technology, and to develop standards to address those technologies. The last two items are kind of opposite, but both of these represent trends that are happening in medical devices. We are seeing more consumerization and commoditization of medical devices. We have heart rate monitors that fit on your wrist now, or the Apple Watch that actually does ECGs and is approved as an ECG device. And those are becoming consumer products. They're mass products, commodities. At the same time, we have a move towards personalized health for some products. And I mentioned earlier the implants, and those are becoming more and more personalized. And with 3D printing, we're going to see a lot of products that are actually developed for specific patients, maybe even in the hospitals. Again, that movement from a manufacturer who provides something and ships it to a manufacturer that is providing healthcare. Next slide, please. Regulatory participation in standards is essential. It's essential not only for the standards developers who need their input, but also for the manufacturers to make sure that they know what the regulators are going to be needed, and for the regulators so they understand the standards, they understand the science behind them, and understand how they connect to what they are trying to do in terms of approving medical devices. Their participation ensures that regulators' concerns are addressed. It promotes the achievement of their regulatory goals, facilitates that common understanding of the standards by the manufacturers and the regulators, and it provides credibility for the standards. It also provides a venue by which manufacturers and regulators can sit together in a fairly open and non-confrontational manner to work through problems in a consensus format. Next slide, please. For the regulators themselves, the existence of standards that supports their regulation and the, I won't say deference of standards by regulation to standards by regulations, but the recognition of standards and the use of standards in regulations and by regulators reduces the administrative burden for regulators. The largest regulator in the world, I think, for medical devices is probably still the US FDA, with thousands of employees, and I think close to 2,000 employees just in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. But they are not, even with that number of employees, they're not always able to have expertise on every technology and every device that's out there. So they depend upon industry, and they depend upon consensus processes to develop standards as ways to set a floor on what is the state of the art. What is, we say minimum safety and performance requirements, but minimum does not mean minimal. It means the minimum under which nothing should fall. This is what needs to happen. So state of the art and minimal, in fact, are synonymous. Regulator involvement in standards lowers cost and improves access for the clinicians who need to have the devices, and it enables the regulator to leverage the experiences of thousands, and it's actually tens of thousands of medical technology experts from around the world in developing requirements. Next slide, please. So it's very important in thinking about participation in international standardization into developing these standards. I went to the databases for ISO and IC, and I looked at the participation by members of the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence on key ISO or IEC committees that address medical devices. And this is this spreadsheet or graph shows that participation. You'll see that many countries participate in many standards, either as observer members or as participating members. Observer members are countries that don't necessarily nominate experts, but they receive the documents, they can comment on them, and they can vote on them, their approval, but they're not actually participating in the committees themselves. Participating members obviously do send the experts to the committee meetings to participate. This is actually a very good participation by members, and obviously there is a strong correlation between the size of countries and the size of their economies and the participation. But I think what our hope would be that over time we will see this graph fill in as more and more countries are able to participate and change their participation from observer to a active participant in the activities. This is the ISO slide, and if you go to the next slide, you'll see the participation of the member countries in IEC standards. Again, not as great, but again, IEC standards tend to be address more high technology, computational or electrical equipment. So it's a little bit, it's not unexpected that this would have a little bit more restricted participation. I'm going to go now and talk very briefly, because I know we're running a little late, about a few of the major standards developers outside of ISO or IEC, the international standards developers that are based in the US. I'll start with my own, AAMI, which used to stand for the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, but as we joke now that the M and the I now stand for healthcare technology, because our scope has broadened, and we have a lot more than just medical instrumentation. We're a professional society. We've been around for over 50 years, and we are accredited to the by the ANSI in our standards activities, which means that we meet the world technical barriers to trade requirements for a standards developing organization. We write our own standards, AAMI standards, but we also develop standards for ISO and IEC, acting to run the secretariats of approximately 12 international ISO or IEC committees. The secretariat means that we are the operating officers acting in an international capacity to manage those committees. Next slide, please. And this is quickly just showing you the participation in AMI from across the globe. The countries that are colored in blue are countries that have formal participation in our standards program, and the little flags, the little yellow circles with the points, point to countries where we have actual members from AMI. So you'll see AMI is in fact a very large, very international organization. We like to really stress that AAMI, neither of those A's stands for American. We consider ourselves an international organization. Next, please. ASTM International is another major organization that's developed standards. It's based in the US, but it's international. They meet the WTO technical barriers to trade agreement. They have participation from over 100 countries and regulatory authorities. And they have cooperation agreements with most national standards bodies in the Inter-American region. Next slide, please. And this is just a quick, I'm not going to go over this too much because I know we're behind time, but this is just the major committees they have in the medical field. The slides will be distributed, so you'll have this information. Let's go on to the next slide. CLSI, the Clinical and Laboratory Standards Institute. As I said, AMI writes standards for medical devices. Some of those standards are general and apply to in vitro diagnostics, but if you're looking for more narrow standards that apply specifically to in vitro diagnostics and in vitro diagnostic testing, CLSI is the organization that has the most expertise there. Again, the Clinical Laboratory Standards International, global standards, and it manages the International Secretariat for ISO TC 212, which develops standards for in vitro diagnostics. Next slide, please. This is just a little bit more information about CLSI. Next slide. MITA, the Medical Imaging and Technology Association, is a division of NEMA in the US, but it's an international organization that works to reduce regulatory barriers, establish standards, and advocate for the medical imaging industry. It's a major member and supporter of DICOM. Next slide. And this just gives you a little information. They have collaboration in North America, Asia, and Western Europe. And they also manage IEC standards for imaging under IEC subcommittee 62B and 62A, which deal with imaging standards internationally. Next slide, please. I have left off a couple of other international organizations based in AMI that are very critical to medical device standards. There are actually probably more than a couple. In particular, IEEE, which writes standards for electrical standards, and specifically for informatics standards, and HL7, which writes specific standards for standards in informatics for the healthcare sector. Both of those are also international organizations. That concludes my presentation. I'd be glad to answer any questions within the time we have left.
Joe, thank you very much for your presentation. We know that was a challenge for you to cover all this information in this short time. We have a couple of comments from the audience, and they are regarding, from Jose Gomez in regards of regulators' involvement in standards development being an excellent approach, and from Carlos Gouveia, congratulating for excellent presentations. So we have no additional questions at this point in time. We again welcome all the audience to forward any specific question that may rise after we are done with the session today. And because of the time constraint that we are at now, I'll transfer immediately to Stephen Bipes to cover the last portion of our session today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra, and thanks to all the presenters today. I think bringing our three-part series to a nice conclusion and leading up to the session we have next week with the FDA. But I wanted to maybe complement some of the information and give some more guidance to the coalition members and our member companies, building off of the previous comments. When we've looked at the World Trade Organization and the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, both Renata and Jessica mentioned the notification points. And just to elaborate on that, the way that the TBT committee works is that every member of the WTO must notify the WTO when it plans to implement a new technical regulation. And it must give the world community via the WTO a 60-day comment period on the draft regulation. So in addition to any domestic consultation that the medical device agencies are conducting within their own countries, there's really a global public consultation that's done through the TBT committee, and anyone and everyone is able to track those notifications and to comment on them. And frankly, the system really only works if all of the parties are tracking the notifications and commenting to them. Renata talked about the e-ping system, which is one way to do that. And if you go to the coalition website, there's information on how to use the e-ping system and also the table of the HS and codes that you need to type in so that you can get those notifications. But I note that several countries, Brazil, also the US, have their own governments have their own systems that the citizens and companies and regulators can track the notification that are being made by other countries via the WTO. So we would encourage you to do that, and we'll get to that in the last slide. But I also wanted to mention that for those of you who have done a home construction or renovation, you know that there's different systems you need to connect, the electrical system, the plumbing, and we're talking here about the standards plumbing. These international standards organizations, they don't just automatically come up with standards. They require the bottom-up participation of industry, of regulators, indeed even practitioners and clinics and patients, and the system, the WTO rules and ISO and IEC and the other SDOs require that those systems be open. So you've got in each country of the world and in the Americas what's called the National Standards Body, which is the member body of that country to ISO. And we include that here. And when you see later when these files are uploaded to the website, you can see that you can click on the links. But suffice to say, each of the associations, members of the coalition, and every company should have a designated liaison to their standards committee, and in that way be tracking the international activity of ISO for medical device standardization. Next slide, please. In the same way, those countries that are active in the International Electrotechnical Commission, the IEC, the coalition members and companies should also be connected with their local national committee to the IEC. Next slide. And well, there's also the ability and connection with these national standards bodies from the Americas and ASTM as an example. And Joe mentioned the list of countries with which AAMI is active. So independent of the international organization that develops the standardization, there is a pathway for the regulators, for the companies, for the associations to get engaged in the standardization, and that work doesn't happen by itself. So next slide, please. And final slide. We, the coalition, and this leads into our meeting that we'll have on July 1, we really recommend the following points. Every coalition, association, member company, and regulatory authority should have, first and foremost, an organization-wide standard strategy or policy. You should have a designated standards lead. When in the United States, when it's in the agency, they call them standards executives, but it doesn't matter what you call them as long as there's someone who's in charge of tracking the standards activity. You should have a designated liaison to your national standards body, member to ISO or IEC or other international standards organization. And I would say both on medical device technical matters as well as on standardization policy matters. We should have a mapping of the organization participation globally. Within your companies, within your association, within your regulatory agency, someone should be identified who tracks the WTO TBT notifications and submits comments on them. That can be done through your local association in the case of AdvaMed or ABIMed or whatever your association is, but that work should be done. Otherwise, the WTO TBT committee will not benefit from your input. And also, all of us should be identifying and coordinating between our quality affairs, regulatory affairs teams, and our trade teams, because this is not just, even though we've talked a lot about standards, it's not just about QA/RA, it's very much linked to what we do on trade. I will conclude my comments there. Thank you, Sandra.
Stephen, thank you very much for your participation. We do not have any additional questions at this point in time, so I will only proceed with the closing remarks, starting by thank you our panelists today, and also to the panelists that helped us putting all these series together. So throughout the 3 past sessions, we have been provided with the opportunity to get familiarized and probably in some cases even surprised on how closely related are health and trade regulations, and because of this, how it becomes a must for us to keep both of them in mind while building our strategies and plans towards regulatory convergence in our sector. This approach will certainly improve patients' access to innovative medical technology through a closer adherence to international standards, and nonetheless will also help to advance compliance with commitments before the TBT committee by the governments in our region. We have also been exposed to the importance of our members and governments having an active role at the standards development organizations through their local technical committees, as they are a key element for us to achieve our vision to get one standard, one test accepted everywhere. This is also a need that becomes more and more evident due to the increasing complexity of innovation in our sector. Of course, increasing convergence will also bring substantial benefits to our governments, not only because taking better care of patients' health, but also through a more effective utilization of their resources. So without further say, we want to thank the Technical Secretariat of the Coalition for the participation of our members in these 3 sessions, and we invite you to become active participants to our 4th session, where we will learn directly from the US FDA on how they have been evolving to apply all these principles within their current policies. Thank you very much, and look forward to meet you all in our next session on Monday next week. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you for joining today's webinar, and thank you to all of our panelists. As a reminder, today's webinar recording and slides will be available to attendees within 24 hours at www.intra-american-coalition-medtech.org. Please refer to the calendar invitation sent by my colleague Erin Leahy at eleahy@advamed.org to register for the additional webinar within this series. You may also reference any communications sent by Sandra or Stephen Vipes. Please also visit advamed.org/events for information on additional virtual educational offerings. Should you have any questions, comments, or feedback, we encourage you to contact us at webinar@advamed.org. Thank you again. This concludes today's presentation.